I think there is much to learn from the characters in this story. It's worth noting at the beginning that all of them, every one of them, was invited at different times, perhaps, and under different circumstances, but they were all invited to the banquet. This banquet that used all through the Old Testament. You heard it in the first reading, this imagery of the great banquet, that moment when God would, if you will, intervene into human history, or if you want to think of it in terms of heaven, or if you want to think of it in terms of God restoring things to the way they were before the fall. However you want to think of it, it was the imagery that was used throughout the Old Testament was this idea of a great banquet. And if you caught the line in Isaiah, it's not just a bunch of food, it's a bunch of good food, choice wines. You know, that imagery may for us not quite carry a lot of weight because we don't live in a situation, most of us, fortunately, where we're just getting by. We have maybe just barely enough food to eat, not even good food, day after day, week after week, year after year. And so the idea of a banquet would be this huge step up, if you will. But we want to remind ourselves that that imagery, you know, however you want to look at it, everyone is invited to it. Everybody's invited into the kingdom. But the first group that was invited, they chose not to come. They had the invitation, they were expected, and everything would have been fine, except other things got in their way. Matthew mentions business and farm. You know, one went to his farm, another to his business. Some just ignored it. Luke, when Luke tells this story, he gives a little more specific excuses, if you will. But one of the interesting things about excuses is that excuses are always about priorities. You always end up revealing, when you give your excuse, what you thought was more important. So in Luke's version, the guy says, I just bought a piece of land and I need to go look at it. Well, he's just basically saying the piece of land is more important than this banquet. You and I might want to give that some thought. Is there something that you and I put in front of the banquet, put in front of God? I mean, just to take one example that may hit home for many of us, think of vacation. You know, so many of the people here in the parish, they come week after week after week, would never think of missing Mass on a weekend, but then they go off on vacation. And somehow, Mass is not as important. You know, they'll go if the opportunity presents itself, you know, if things work out, but otherwise, well, maybe not. And whether we want to admit it or not, in those moments, what we're saying is vacation is the priority. Lots of possibilities there. I have shared with the congregation on a couple occasions. There was a time in my life where my bicycle was in front of God. People always think that's silly, but believe me, it was true. And it can be anything. So many different things that we can put in front. And we know we're invited to this great banquet, to this fullness of life that Jesus offers us. And there's just part of us that I'm going like, well, but there's this thing that I want to do first. And what about this poor guy in the end of this story, the guy who was not dressed properly? This is not, of course, a story about dress code, but you have to look at it. You know, here's a guy, he's got this invitation now to the banquet, and he wants to come, and he shows up, but he's not willing to show up, if you will, in the right way, with the right attitude. You know, there's obligations to the invitation. The invitation is more than just show up and eat. There's at least some minimal expectations that go with that invitation. And one of those in that culture would have been you were dressed appropriately. Again, I wonder if that doesn't, apply to us in some way. The good Lord offers us this invitation to the banquet, to this fullness of life, and we say, well, yeah, absolutely, I want to go. And we sort of, if you will, show up, but we want to show up on our terms. So we take the issue of like human sexuality, this great gift of God, and we say, God, I'm going to come to the banquet, and I want this fullness of life that you offer me, but when it comes to that area of my life, I'm doing what I want. Take it or leave it, because that's the way this is going to be. I'm not going to fulfill your expectations in that area of my life. For others of us, it's money and possessions. We'll be happy to enter into the banquet as long as the good Lord keeps his hands out of my wallet, to put it bluntly. All sorts of possibilities there where we're not completely ready. We want the banquet, but we're not actually ready to really enter into it. Third group of people in this story that's worth paying attention to, of course, are the people that they got an invitation. They knew what it meant, and they took it, and they showed up. They showed up, or they were invited in, and there they are, and they are enjoying this marvelous moment for them. And that is, of course, what awaits all of us. Not only in the future, not only in heaven, but now. If you and I, the good Lord promises us this, if you and I would embrace the invitation in all its fullness, if we embrace the invitation, then Jesus is saying, yeah, absolutely. You enter into this fullness of life. You enter into the banquet. And so if perhaps those first two different people did not teach you anything, maybe for you the lesson is just one of thanksgiving, because you've been invited to the banquet. And what more could you want than to be invited to a banquet of the Lord?